Good morning, everyone who is online and who is here in person. The plenary downstairs has only just finished. We're going to please give a couple of extra minutes before we start this special session on sustainable procurement. Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this special session on sustainable procurement. I would like to invite His Excellency, Dr. Nasir Yassin, the Minister of Environment from the Ministry of Environment, Lebanon, to open this session with some introductory remarks.
Thank you. Good morning. I have a few notes written here and I'll go over them, but I want to start with no. So just to know what to say, huh? Recording is in progress. Yes. When a year ago or so, I think more than a year ago, it was in the first few sessions we had in the Council of Ministers. And a colleague was discussing his plans towards buses, getting my colleague, Minister of Transport, to put it this way. And they said France is going to help us in purchasing of some buses or donating some buses. And, I raised my hand. I said, we need to think of transport in a sustainable way. So when we want to get buses, we need to think of them and their impact on the environment. When we need to do energy, we need to think of renewable energy. I don't think they heard my remark quite well. And they brought classical, conventional buses that are not operating at the moment. But just to give you an anecdote of what we face when we talk about sustainable procurement and green procurement. But I would like to frame this discussion today on sustainable procurement as an essential element in structural reforms, rather than just as a technical aspect or a technical instrument. Such reforms that most developing countries, including Lebanon, need to address. And indeed, to frame the discussion on sustainable procurement as part and parcel of green recovery and green transition. When we think of reforms and transition, we think of greening those recovery and transition. Sustainable procurement becomes at the heart of such discussion and such a debate. And this actually, when we work on such recovery, would become our way to achieve our sustainable development goals. And I believe this would ensure that growth that we all aim to have is going to be more sustainable. We can create more jobs, more green jobs for that matter, all as part of integrating environment, climate action in the reform and recovery plans. Something I would say is easier said than implemented. It's easier done in forums like this one with the UN and a lot of UN agencies than actually implemented. Yet, as public procurement makes around 18% of the GDP in the MENA region, in our region. In Lebanon, 20% of the expenditures before the crisis was actually public procurement. It's vital then to build a narrative, and that's essential, a narrative around the necessity of reforming procurement systems in general, and of course, to make them built on the concepts of sustainability. We need a narrative that can seamlessly, that can be understood by everybody to show the interaction between procurement and development. And I don't think, honestly, it's very clear for everybody. Furthermore, and needless to say, it's vital to build the capacities of the public sector on green procurement at all levels, but particularly at the local level. We in Lebanon, in the latest Public Procurement Act, which was a game changer, I would say, public entities, particularly at the local level, have been struggling in understanding it, not to say even implementing it. This is particularly important that many environmental projects are implemented by municipalities and local authorities. So they are the frontliners, yet they're the least to understand and comprehend what do we mean by the current public procurement reform, and then to add the layer of green and sustainable procurement. But allow me to highlight 3 examples we've been proposing in Lebanon to advance green transition in general. First, integrating green recovery principles in key state investments, including electricity, transport, water resource management, wastewater, and solid waste management. And here at the heart of all of these, we have sustainable procurement measures to be included. Secondly, introducing physical and financial instruments for promoting green recovery through specific environmental physical instruments and green accounting to reverse the cause of environmental degradation. It's annually around $2.35 billion. And thirdly, strengthening governance systems for greening the forthcoming recovery program, something we're discussing at the moment with IMF, through sustainable public procurement and strengthening the enforcement of social and environmental safeguards, so we can improve our environmental performance. I will give 7 actions, so not only at the level of headlines. That's something we're discussing with the level of government to include in the recovery plan and the transition towards greener recovery. First, establish a gradual, proportional, and interactive cost recovery system for solid waste management system built on the foundation of circular economy. And this is key if we want to work on the procurement for solid waste management, to build such, reforming the solid waste management system on the circular economy foundations, and of course, decentralization. Secondly, this is something we are working on continuously. That's actually to undertake the administrative and legal measures to collect the quarrying sector's use of the national treasury and facilitate the improve of raw material. As a matter of fact, between parentheses, if we're going to apply sustainable and green procurement measures in Lebanon, when it comes to the cement industry and the outsourcing of cement, not a single project would actually qualify, because they're all polluting, they're all degrading the environment. I mean, significantly. Any cement industry is polluting, but they're significantly polluting. So it won't apply. We would stop or actually put a halt to many of those projects. Thirdly, produce a set of master's plans for environmentally sensitive areas in the country, particularly nature reserves, high mountains, river basins, and so on. Because this is also essential when we plan development initiatives. Fourth, explore the possibility of using debt for nature climate swap instrument to improve the environment in Lebanon in terms of contributing towards attaining the SDGs and achieving our nationally determined contributions. Fifth, align the financial system with sustainable development through green accounting and other measures, including due consideration given to climate-induced physical and transition risks. 6th point, green the banking system. The banking system that's collapsing. I don't know how they translated this. Okay. Green the banking system through abiding by the Equator Principles for determining, assessing, and managing environmental and social risk in project finance. And 7th, establish the Lebanon Green Investment Facility, something we're working on to promote environment and climate-friendly activities with the UN decreed compensation to Lebanon, as actually after the Israeli attack in 2006 and the oil slick that actually resulted from this attack, which amounts to around $900 million as seed money for this, but also to add more to this facility. All of the above are foods for thought, but they require a stable policy environment and functioning institutions, but also a private sector that needs to shift genuinely towards sustainable practices and alternatives. And actually for this private sector to avoid greenwashing. There are some positive changes recently with more firms signing up for the ESGs, environmental, social, and governance practices and measures, and we need to have more of these. So it's also a message to the private sector and to private firms to engage in this dialogue. So what I presented are some ideas for the panel. Perhaps they have even more. There are more specialists around the table. So I look forward to hearing them and to hear more about their ideas. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for these introductory remarks. I'd like to highlight your emphasis on sustainable procurement being more than just the transactional aspect of sustainable procurement, but how procurement can be used as an instrument and as an enabler to drive sustainable development. This also helps us set the scene for this session, and we'd like to split our time into two different events. Hopefully, we'll leave enough time to open the floor to questions and answers for the audience. I'd like to start this session with a bit more of an informal fireside discussion with Jocelyn Jabbour, the procurement manager from the World Bank, and Anne-Claire Howard, the procurement director at UNOPS. This will further help set the scene. They will discuss some of the issues around sustainable procurement and how it is defined and how hopefully procurement can demonstrate its impact in sustainable development. We'll then move on to a moderated panel discussion where the two of them will be joined by Vanya Osovich online from the ILO and Musonda Kusonde from UNICEF, also joining virtually online, and Mario Jalles from UNESCO. This panel session will focus on the realities of implementing sustainable procurement, and we'll have time for questions and answers from the floor. I'd like to hand the floor over to Anne-Claire Howard.
Thank you very much, and welcome to all of you in the room and to all of you virtually online. It's great to be here, and thank you for ESCWA for hosting us today. Your Excellency focused on a lot of really important elements, especially around the greening of public procurement. And what I wanted to stress was the vital role that the private sector plays in this, because public expenditure is it's that relationship between the public and the private sector. The enabler of sustainable procurement is the private sector and how it responds to the increasing demand for sustainable procurement. So you've heard the word sustainable procurement a lot now, but I think like a lot of these, fancy acronyms like ESG and SDGs, how do we actually define this? What does sustainable procurement actually mean? And I think if I asked everyone in this room for their definition of it, it would be different. So what we've tried to do here, and I'll ask Jocelyn to answer this first question, is really, what do we mean by sustainable procurement? What does it actually mean? Is it green procurement? Is it about human rights? Is it about labor rights? How can we help the private sector frame what we in the public sector struggle to define ourselves? Jocelyn.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Anne-Claire. Let me first thank you and the team for organizing this special session, because considering the significant role that procurement contribute in GDP, as His Excellency mentioned, I think it's important for sustainable procurement towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. So sustainable procurement, I know that a lot refers for sustainable procurement as green procurement, but actually sustainable procurement refers to the whole process of purchasing goods, works, and services, taking into consideration not only the environment, but also the economical and the social impact of the procurement over the entire life cycle of the project. So in terms of, for example, from economic perspective, sustainable procurement can help optimize, for example, cost over the long run, or minimize waste, or ensuring supply chain resilience. From social perspective, sustainable procurement can ensure fair labor practices or job creation, or supporting and engaging with local communities, for example. And from environmental perspective, this is what we call green procurement or climate smart procurement. So for me, sustainable procurement is a little bit this balance between the needs of the government and the needs of the society, the economy, and the environment. And in order to implement sustainable procurement, it is important also for government to integrate sustainability criteria into the procurement laws, strategies, policies, and procedures to give the grounds for the procurement practitioners to embed sustainability into procurement decision-making. So the World Bank here also helps the government to develop these strategies, these policies and laws to make sure sustainable procurement is implemented and the practices are in compliance with the sustainable procurement to achieve the sustainable development goals. So ultimately, sustainable procurement can help governments reduce their environmental footprint, support social responsibility, and enhance their reputation and competitiveness.
Thanks, Jocelyn. This is actually, very daunting. There's a lot to cover here, and I've run a small enterprise in a Western country, and we struggled to deliver on all these expectations. So, and I know that this topic is increasingly important, but increasingly challenging. How the vast majority of our economies are built on micro, small, and medium enterprises. How can they respond to this increasing demand from our agencies, from development banks, from the UN to have more sustainable procurement when they're struggling themselves to meet, the basic requirements of the countries that they live in? What steps can the private sector take to respond to this demand without us being exclusive? Because we need to be mindful of being inclusive of everyone in our processes.
Let me start by saying that the World Bank recognizes the critical role that the private sector engagement and public-private partnerships play in accelerating towards the sustainable development goals, because the private sector is often at the forefront of innovation, developing new technologies and approaches that can help address the social and environmental challenges that the government may be facing. So usually the private sector has significant access to financial resources, which can be leveraged to support the achievement of the sustainable development goal. And by engaging the private sector, whether SMEs, which is basically give them maybe the preference or maybe give them a percentage from procurement, or through PPPs, public-private partnerships, which is at a larger scale, we can tap into these resources from the private sector and mobilize additional funding to support sustainable development. And I have attended the plenary session that happened this morning. And I think also the private sector role was as well focused on how the private sector can help in achieving the sustainable development goals. And this is where sustainable procurement come in, because usually the whole implementation of any project depend on procurement, and advancing in a project depend on procurement, and using sustainable practices, procurement practices, is very important. So the private sector has a much larger potential to operate than traditional development actors. And this scale can be harnessed to achieve the sustainable development goals more quickly and efficiently. So we can always value the partnership between the public sector and the private sector, specifically on SMEs, on local communities. This is important to help the government and the traditional players in the procurement sector to move towards achieving the sustainable development goals through sustainable procurements.
Thank you. And I think that's really important is the tie between the government and these private sector enterprises. And I wonder, Your Excellency, if I can bring you in on this. Mm-hmm. How can you better leverage through sustainable procurement the massive potential that the private sector, for instance, in your country has to contribute to the SDGs?
I mean, I fully agree with Jocelyn. The private sector can be first a partner with the government in implementing a lot of the development projects or investments that we aim at working on, and having it's of course in Lebanon we have a vibrant private sector, and it's a natural partner for the government. But yet they want to draw a line that, you know, private sector, and this is for Lebanon, perhaps for others, but I want to focus on Lebanon. The private sector in Lebanon has enjoyed a lot of concessions, partly concessions in relation to monopolizing certain sectors. So less competitiveness doesn't mean actually that the private sector, if there is less competitive and we have some private sector doing a lot of work, it doesn't mean that this is a very successful private sector. Secondly, private sector has been used to easy money. Now, if I have someone in the room, they will push back, but this is the whole idea of the debate. They've been used to easy money and easy access to money. And thirdly, there's a lot of hidden vested interests between private sector and some people in government. So all these three, hi Silvana, all these three actually we need to address when we work on reforming the procurement. That's why the procurement, as Marcus mentioned, is not only a bureaucratic measure, it's a reform process. It's an agenda towards really reforming a lot of the work of government as well as the private sector. That's why we need a private sector that can engage in this debate and this dialogue. Yes, theoretically, fully agree with Jocelyn, the private sector is a natural partner. They've been quite active in Lebanon. They're filling a lot of gaps, but we need to promote a quite sustainable, well-governed, socially responsible, environmentally conscious private sector. For long, the private sector in Lebanon, I'm talking about projects that deal with environment, just to be on the safe side, they've been actually given and rewarded big projects because of their either connections to government or actually because they've been practicing less and less sustainable or environmentally conscious measures. So they would make a lot of benefit out of these procurement or out of these projects. So let's face it, when we say the private sector and we celebrate it, this is great, but we need also the private sector to look at self in the mirror and really engage with this discussion rather than think that the private sector is kind of immune from all those things that we always blame the government for. And that's my message to the people around the room if they are from the private sector.
No, thank you. And I think that's a great message. I think one of the comments that you made for me outlined one of the key messages around sustainable procurement is it's about using public funds, not just to achieve an outcome, so the what, but it's also about the sustainability of the how you achieve that outcome. And I think that's where enabling sustainable procurement is so essential, because it's not just about building that hospital, it's about how did we build that hospital? What companies were involved? How did we get the right companies or the right public sector workers or private sector workers to support the delivery of this outcome in a way that in itself is sustainable? And I think that's often the link that we don't focus on enough is the how we've actually delivered as opposed to the what we've delivered. But thank you. I think there's some really interesting aspects to this conversation. What I will do now is maybe we can broaden this to the rest of the people, both virtually and physically in the room. But I think first we have a couple of things we'd like to share. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, Jocelyn and Anne-Claire. It was a great discussion, brought up some very good food for thought. I hope that this has also helped set the scene for the participants online and the participants in the room, and an understanding more of how the concepts of sustainable procurement are approached and also perceived. I hope that you're getting a better idea how public procurement is done sustainably and how it can have a positive impact on driving towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. As we transition into the panel, I'd like to take a few minutes of your time to show you two videos, one from the ILO on how they implement some of their concepts within the region, and another one from UNOPS of a supplier from the private sector who participates actively in trying to be an enabler in driving sustainable development within the aspects of the space. Thank you.
So this is the bit where we hope that IT works, so bear with us.
While we wait for the videos to start, I'd just like to touch on the point of the conversation, Your Excellency, that you brought up about bringing the private sector into this space of conversation and allowing them to understand the responsibility that they also have. Like you say, it's very easy for us to band around the phrasing that private sector plays a role. But what does that really mean? And I think that one of the points that you do highlight is that it's about taking a responsibility as well. It's about having a responsibility while you're being part of that dialogue and understanding that only through this collaboration, these efforts can be driven forward. Okay, and while we're waiting for the technology to catch up with us, we're going to actually move over to the panel and touch on the previous conversation, and also the videos that you'll see at the end of this session. They also highlight the critical role that the private sector, as we've discussed, the role that they play in delivering sustainable development. But as highlighted, this is also not a very easy task. It's not an easy task for the private sector as well as the public space. We'll have a role to play in this and achieving the sustainable procurement practices. I'd like to invite the esteemed additional members of the panel to introduce themselves and give an introduction of who they are and their role that they play. Vanya, can I please give you the floor?
Thank you, Marcus. Good morning, everyone. So my name is Vanya Ostojic. I'm chief of the ILO Procurement Bureau based in Geneva. We have extensive development cooperation portfolio in the region, and in particular since 2015 as part of the Syria refugee crisis. So I will say during the panel discussion a couple of words about what we are doing in this area.
Thank you very much, Vanya. Masonda, can you please introduce yourself?
Indeed, thank you, Marcus. Good afternoon, colleagues. I stand on existing protocols. My name is Musonda Kasonde. I'm the Regional Chief of Supply and Logistics for UNICEF MENA based in Amman, so covering the region, overseeing procurement and supply chain activities across the 21 countries we have in the region. Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Musonda. Can I please bring the conversation back into the room and give you the floor, Mario?
Thank you, Marcus. Good morning and good afternoon for those who are watching us from other time zones. My name is Mario Jales. I'm an economist here at ESCWA, and I work in the cluster that deals with the 2030 Agenda and SDG coordination. And it's a pleasure to be here today to bring this private sector element to the discussion and talk about one of our recent publications that deals with this topic.
Great. Thank you very much, Mario. And we look forward to hearing about this most recent publication. Okay, so let's get straight into it. It's been touched upon. It's understood that stakeholder collaboration is key to implementing sustainable procurement practices. Vanya, if I can call upon you to discuss the ILO activities in the region and the work that you do with various stakeholders. Can you please tell us about this approach, the benefits of this approach, and how this actually works in practice, please?
Yes, thank you, Marcus. So as I mentioned, ILO is historically present in the region, in particular in Lebanon. Our regional office is based there. We have country and project offices in Jordan, Qatar, Iraq. Now we are moving to Syria. And the region became one of the main clients of procurement in terms of volumes, in terms of complexity of activities. And from the outset, all these procurement activities have been aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals, in particular Sustainable Development Goal 8, decent work and economic growth, whereby our approach was to align and share values with all involved stakeholders, starting with the donor country, the government of Federal Republic of Germany, represented by its development bank, KfW, and our local partners, Ministry of Labor, Ministry of Social Affairs, municipalities, and then, of course, the private sector, the business community. ILO, as the implementing agent, is throughout this process sharing these values associated with the Sustainable Development Goals and all aspects of it, whether it is promotion of small and medium enterprises, economic development at the local scale, protection of environment, and of course, social responsible procurement. So all three ingredients of the sustainability are there. ILO is development agency, and the way we are structured is to work on the long-term development projects. And part of the challenge, in particular in the context of Syria refugees crisis, was how to address this internal dilemma of humanitarian development nexus, as we call it. That is how to transform immediate response and humanitarian aid in the long-term sustainable development. And the answer to that is to embed from the outset the criteria of sustainability in every aspect of the project, and then drive it throughout every stage of the procurement process. So starting with at the programmatic level, when we are establishing the content and the indicators of performance for the project, then these criteria, of course, facilitate the life of procurement people, because we can integrate them in our tender documents, in our evaluation criteria, and of course, throughout the project implementation, monitor and report on the implementation. So I would say that the key answer to that question, how do we do it, is to ensure that all the stakeholders are aligned, and of course, that everything we do is in the full support of the National Development Agenda.
Thank you very much, Vanya. I think it also highlights the importance of stakeholder engagement. And on that point, Jocelyn, do you think I could bring you in, particularly because the role as a stakeholder, the important role as a donor, as a stakeholder plays? And I'd like to phrase the question around value for money as a donor when trying to engage with these type of interactions and public engagements. We know it's a top priority when engaging with public procurement and private partnerships, but how would you explain this in the context of sustainable procurement? And how can you explain it in the context of the World Bank? How do you ensure value for money when you're dealing with public procurement, public-private partnerships, and the implementation of projects? Thank you.
Okay, so in the context of sustainable procurement, achieving value for money means ensuring that the sustainable procurement practices do not compromise the cost effectiveness of the product life cycle. And the World Bank recognizes that value for money is a top priority. And this was reflected in our procurement framework that became effective in July 2016. So the value for money, the bank's procurement framework seeks to achieve this value for money with integrity when doing procurement on two levels. Maybe under the umbrella of the reforms, where we support and provide technical assistance to the governments to build the institutions and the procurement practices of those institutions in a way that it achieves value for money through sustainable procurement, even when pursuing sustainable procurement. And under the umbrella of the operations, where we follow up and guide the governments on how to implement the projects financed by the bank in a way that they use acceptable or appropriate procurement approaches and method, or procurement that respond to the sustainability. So the bank's procurement processes bidding documents, contract conditions, the whole procurement library have been expanding to reflect this fit-for-purpose approach that was introduced in the procurement framework, and ensuring sustainable procurement practices and sustainable development at the end of the day. So it aligns procurement selection methods with modern best practices, options, and tools to support the value for money in decision-making. I'll give an example that was introduced also in the framework, which is the use of rated criteria in evaluating proposal, in evaluating bids. So to evaluate the sustainability and innovative aspects of proposals and bids. The use of rated criteria will become mandatory starting July 2023 for all international competitive bidding. This is something that we aim to achieve through the sustainable procurement approach. Another example would be the Paris alignment. Paris alignment is now a corporate priority for the bank, and all our operations that are expected to be delivered in the next fiscal year, 2024, will have to be Paris aligned. This is also another example on our approach for value for money and sustainability. Those two examples are at the level of the framework. I can give also an example at the level of the project. For example, we have introduced the tool of what we call project procurement strategy for development. This is a strategy that the client developed during the preparation of the project, and it describes how the procurement will support the project development objectives and how it will ensure delivering value for money and sustainability through the implementation of the project.
Thank you very much, Jocelyn. It's extremely interesting, and it also highlights the importance of understanding the role that the sustainable elements play. Your Excellency, I hope you don't mind if I pull you in here and see if I can get your point, particularly on the notion of the common interpretation we see as procurement professionals, where best value for money means lowest cost. And this is something we're trying to address, something which Jocelyn touched on. Do you think you can talk to us about, within a national context, how best value for money isn't only lowest cost?
I mean, I fully agree with Jocelyn, and I'm glad she mentioned the Paris alignment. I think we tend to forget about this, particularly in aid agencies, and I think it's very good to keep it in discussion. I mean, yes, conventional procurement measures or programs are actually geared towards efficiency, right? Let's make things more efficient. Although efficiency doesn't mean less money, but still everything is around efficiency. But yet we need to be equally focused on effectiveness of whatever we're doing, right? We need to be doing the right thing. Of course, we need to do it right, but we need to do the right things in order to get results. And all this discussion on results-based, evidence-based, result-oriented needs to be involved in, we need to be involved in designing it while we look into such big projects or designing procurement measures. Still, and this is from reflecting on some of the experiences we had at the level of local authorities or at the level of central government agencies, some of the contracts were given to the lowest bidder in solid waste, for example. Yet, when you look into the numbers, this doesn't make sense. There's something wrong, because when you look into the best practices, look at the literature, bring in all the design of those projects, those won't make the equation doesn't make sense. There's something wrong. They're either doing it in a less effective way to cover this low cost that they put in as a bid, or they're not doing it at all, or someone is doing a cover-up. And this is what actually we ended doing. We ended having. So we need to look at efficiency, we need to look at effectiveness, but also we need to look at equity. We need to be equitable in those interventions and projects. And the equity dimension tends to be forgotten. We need to cater for everybody based on their need. And that's something that can be costly. It doesn't mean this would be the cheapest way, but it would be the most effective, the most equitable way. And then I add the fourth E to add in the environment layer and sustainability measures. I think this is how we need to see it. I'm not a specialist in procurement. You are here around the table, but this is how I see it as a decision maker. It's not only the cheapest offer we have on the table, it's the most effective. It's the most effective in delivering results. It's the most intervention that can lead to equity in society, and it's the most environmentally conscious in terms of the sustainability measures that carries. And I think these 4 E's, are just put them this way, are key to be discussed in any big project or any procurement.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. It actually gives us a good transition when Jocelyn's talking about the importance of establishing frameworks, and you've also given me the letter E to transition into the next question. The next question is going to be talking about enablers and how we can put into practice what we're actually talking about and what we're trying to achieve around the table. Masonda, I'm wondering if I can bring you in, please, from the UNICEF side and focus on the question that when we start talking about implementation from a sustainable procurement perspective, a typical question usually gravitates around where do you start? Can you share from your organization's perspective how you would approach this? Maybe you can share some examples, stages of maturity, and as I highlighted with the E, can you focus a bit on enablers in order to get moving? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Marcus. Indeed, I mean, as an organization, UNICEF in the MENA region alone, this region is spending on average $1 billion a year. So certainly there is this, there's an emphasis on being responsible in our procurement and leading by example. I think as an organization, the starting point was really to embed sustainable procurement considerations within our regular procurement policies and procedures. So in essence, to institutionalize the concepts. So there is now a clear policy and guidelines around this, which has been deliberately rolled out, pushed out across all offices in the region and globally, including through very practical forums like webinars and sharing sites. So now, in essence, all UNICEF offices, and this extends to partners as well, because we have a huge network of partners, must consider these environmental, the social, and the economic issues in all aspects of the supply chain. And there's some very clear guidance. I think we debated it for many years, actually, before we really crystallized the guidance and what in essence could happen or needs to happen. Some practical tools that have been rolled out now. I mean, in terms of how this plays out in practice, I mean, there is no one size fits all. So each sort of country is responsible for defining the how and the what, how they will implement sustainable procurement in their context. But just to illustrate with some examples, I'm starting with one right there in Lebanon, actually, which was my former country office. I mean, UNICEF Lebanon, with the Ministry of Public Health, is in the process of implementing a solarization project, which is covering 150 health facilities. And there's already discussions around expanding the same to schools. So in this context, right up front from planning, these sustainable criteria was put in place, touching upon the environment in terms of clean energy, but also, of course, addressing economic and social aspects. There's also been significant investment by deliberate choice in solar refrigeration and freezers as part of the immunization supply chain strengthening. And this is over other refrigerator types that are available on the market, and similar projects going on in other countries in the region. The second example I'd like to highlight, which is very particular to this region as well, and also one that I'm very passionate about, is the one of local procurement. I mean, I recall at the beginning of the COVID pandemic when we needed PPE and other supplies, and literally got shut out of the markets. So for me, this was a rude awakening as to how unsustainable our procurement practices were. And at the end of the day, it was our local suppliers who came through for us. So now there is a deliberate effort in the region to increase sourcing from local markets. And almost all countries in our region, in the Middle East and North Africa region, have or are in the process of conducting market surveys for essential supplies. And we hope that this will also help to expose suppliers to items typically procured globally. So we even expand that to our global supply base. And we have examples of suppliers in the region who are supplying globally. In terms of enablers, maybe I will turn a constraint on its head and speak to it as an enabler. When we talk about local procurement, especially, and I mean the capacity, I think it's been touched upon earlier by one of the panelists, the capacity of local suppliers who are generally small to medium-sized enterprises to compete with multinational companies who by nature are able to provide more competitive terms is very evident. So in terms of an enabler, reframing that as an enabler, what we mean by best value for money needs to be turned on its head, and we need to incorporate sustainability criteria into our evaluations and contracted decisions when we're determining what is best value for money to give more opportunities to the local market. Also in terms of aligning with government on their vision, I used the Lebanon experience earlier. I mean, this solarization project is very much a government vision led by the government in Lebanon, by the Ministry of Health, a vision that UNICEF is supporting. So very much aligning, I think, is an enabler, is also an enabler. Internally within my organization, I think we still have a way to go in making sustainable procurement a higher priority on every agenda at every level. And I think we need indicators. Now I think we've sort of crystallized the terminology, the practices, what it means, but now we need indicators to be able to measure progress and compliance. I'll stop there for now, Marcus, and hand back.
Thank you very much, Musonda. It's very insightful to see how you're taking these steps towards implementation and how they're translating into actual practice. And Claire, I'm wondering if I can bring you in from the UNOPS perspective. Generally speaking, UNOPS is regarded as a leader in sustainable procurement or the implementation of sustainable procurement within the UN space. I'm wondering if you can elaborate on how UNOPS has approached embedding sustainable procurement within its processes, and within this, maybe start looking at identifying some points that entities could look at to start off as key areas of priority.
Thanks, Marcus. I think, to be honest, that most UN entities are slowly catching up to UNOPS when it comes to sustainable procurement. I think we were the first to put pen to paper on this, but our collaboration with all the other agencies across the UN has led to all of us moving in a positive direction on sustainable procurement. There's a couple of very tangible things we've done, but I'm going to echo a couple of Sunda's points because I think they're really important. The first one is around really the design of projects and the planning stage and how critical it is to look at sustainable procurement at the offset of any of these programs. We tend to come to it too late and at a stage where you can no longer influence things enough to actually make them truly sustainable. I think the second element is really around this alignment of the donor requirements when these are donor funded projects and of the national development priorities. And I think for me, that's really where you can truly leverage the value of sustainable procurement. In terms of what we've done within UNOPS, I think there's a lot of things to touch upon. I think one of our key programs has really been around working in very close collaboration with our suppliers and with the private sector and our partners in the private sector. We introduced a program called Drive, which is now mandatory for all UNOPS tenders. So suppliers have to fill in a self-assessment around their sustainability criteria. And we use this not as a tool to disqualify suppliers, but we use it as a tool really to start engaging in a dialogue with suppliers to just build that awareness of what these sustainability criteria mean, what they're meant to achieve, why they're important. But also we use them to start highlighting risk within our projects. So for instance, if a supplier rates themselves very high on every single aspect of sustainability, you can look at it through two lenses. One, which is, well, either they don't actually know what they're answering, and then you can engage in a conversation with them around, well, no, these are important criteria. It's not just a tick the box exercise. It's really about building your capacity to deliver on these aspects of sustainability. The other one is, well, there's no way they can be performing that well. So should I flag this? Should I pay more attention to this supplier? Is it worth having a site inspection and going to see, are they performing as well as they say they are? But it's really around trying to use sustainability as an enabler for dialogue, because we were talking about, impact and not just focusing on the outcome. For us, building up the capacity of local suppliers, and we're very proud that more than 60% of UNOPS procurement is usually done at the local level. So the spend is in the country that is where the project is located. But we also believe that the lasting impact you can have, the legacy you leave behind beyond the project, is if you've enabled supplier capacity to increase. And supplier capacity, especially on these sustainability subjects, which are complicated, to make small incremental steps in the right direction. Even just building awareness. We've had conversations with suppliers who, they're not at the level of maturity where they're going to tell you what their carbon footprint is. They don't even know where to start. So if we started asking, we want you to disclose your carbon footprint, we'd basically exclude everyone from the market. But what we do is say, okay, well, no, but why is this important? Why is it a question that other companies may be asking you, other organizations? And it's not about you being able to measure it now, but it's comprehending, okay, but if I switch to a better electricity provider for my company, then maybe I can lower my footprint. So it's not about the measurement, it's about slowly integrating into behaviors, patterns of change. And I think that's been very successful. I think the other aspect, and it's not necessarily about the private sector themselves, it's about actually our personnel within the organization, is how do you build the capacity, not of the procurement officers, but of everyone across the organization to understand what aspects of sustainability within a project are relevant, what aspects do we all need to be looking at when we're engaging with all of our counterparts, and empowering people to make the right decisions. Because I think, as we discussed when we were talking about value for money, we still, despite all of the literature, all of the discussions we have around value for money not being the lowest cost, but actually being much more than that, there is still a natural tendency for people to gravitate towards the lowest price item. And a lot of this isn't about just understanding sustainability, it's about how do you empower individuals to push back when they're told, yes, but this is more expensive. How do you empower them to say, yes, it might be more expensive, but the overall value, the overall effectiveness, the overall efficiency is better. And I think those are some of the things we're slowly trying to integrate. And the third aspect, and then I'll be quiet, is around having more discussions with the private sector. So we use the possibilities program in UNOPS. We engage with suppliers. We have supplier forums where we will engage with the whole of the private sector in a country. We will bring in the banks to talk about access to finance, because we recognize that very often that's a constraint to be able to access local suppliers. And we talk to them about, how do you work with the UN? How do you bid for UN projects? How do you become competitive in these markets, which may seem very challenging? Things as basic as, how can you create an online profile for you as a supplier? And how can you have access to the market opportunities that we offer? And a lot of that has actually been really, really helpful in broadening our supplier base at a local level. We have projects in really challenging regions, like in Mozambique, where we've managed to still procure locally in regions that are unstable, that are war-torn, and this has worked really well. We've done great projects in Yemen, where, thanks to the World Bank's support, who pushed us to work with women-owned businesses, we managed to spend, a huge chunk of this project's funding on women-owned businesses in a place where people told us it was impossible, that we would never achieve this. So I think it goes back to my initial point, which is, if you align, the donor requirements, the national agenda, the priorities of a country, and then bring in the private sector to support that, then you can achieve maximal outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne-Claire. It's nicely led us to move over to focusing on the private sector, Mario. And I'd like you to try and bring in this private sector angle for us, to look at the different engagements between private sector, public sector. And as this discussion has highlighted, it's emphasized the strategic mechanisms and the importance of how the private sector can accelerate contributions towards sustainable development goals. With UNESCO's mandate to promote economic and social development in West Asia, in the regional, sub-regional cooperation and integration, can you please elaborate on how you work with the private sector and the role that the private sector has in achieving the sustainable development agenda, please?
Thank you, Marcus. Just a quick comment that I'm representing ESCO and not UNESCO. But yeah, we've heard a lot about the importance of the private sector, how it's vital for sustainable procurement. But what do we really know about the private sector in the Arab region? And what do we know especially about their contributions to the SDGs? So these are the two questions that I'll address here. And I think this will provide a lot of elements to think further on the work of sustainable procurement. So many of the comments I'll make here today, they come from the recent publication we launched this week for the AFSD. It's the Annual SDG Review 2023. The subtitle is The Private Sector and the SDGs in the Arab Region. And this is the second edition in this series, our series Annual SDG Review. And this year, we're focused on the private sector. This publication actually is included in the package that all participants got when they registered for the meeting, the physical package you have. It's also available online on the ESCO website. So what do we know about the private sector and its contributions to the private sector, to the SDGs? The first thing is, I need to mention this, is that there's not a full data set that can provide perfect answers. So our findings, they're based on available data, which is incomplete data, but they're still useful. So what we have found, we found out that both in the environmental front, the social front, and the governance front, that the private sector in the region is underperforming. So in terms of environment, so that's the E in ESG, right? This is a term that comes a lot when we're talking about private sector and in the SDGs. So in the environmental front, the performance is weak compared to other regions, especially compared to other developing regions, because we cannot always compare the Arab region to North America or Europe or Western Europe, but we can compare to other developing regions, and the region does underperform. We see, for example, that even though this is the most water scarce region in the world, it has high levels of water use inefficiency, much higher than in other regions where water is more easily available. So this is very surprising. We also found out that only about 15% of firms that were contacted and interviewed, only about 15% actually measure or monitor water consumption. So we're dealing with a private sector where 85% of companies don't even monitor their water consumption. For energy consumption, it's a little bit better. Instead of 15, it's 33%, but it's still a very low percentage of companies. We also see that in the region, the CO2 emission per unit of value added is more than twice as high as in the global average. So the region is producing, and for any region, if you're producing, you do emit some level of CO2, but we're emitting twice as much as the global average. Let's move then to the social front, the second letter of ESG. Then we can say that the performance is even worse. Especially in terms of gender equality and migrant workers. So in the region, only 20% of women work, while the world average is around 45 to 46%. And in the Arab region, 70% of men work. So if you compare 20% to 70%, that's a huge difference. And this is reflected in the private sector. Also in the region, we have very low participation of women in ownership of businesses, and even lower participation in management of businesses. So it's under 10%, that companies that are owned and managed by women. So we are very far away from gender equality. In some countries, usually more advanced countries, there are rules now that the management needs to be split. You need to have 50-50%. We're very far from that at this point. On the governance front, so the third letter of ESG, we see that corruption is a main problem for the private sector in the region. This was highlighted in the previous plenary. One of the participants, in her concluding remarks, she mentioned that corruption would be the single item that she would highlight that needs improvement to make things work. Actually, one of the SDG indicators is about the incidence of bribery. And it's not surprised that also in the Arab world, the incidence of bribery, which means the percentage of firms that acknowledge that they've given or received a request for bribery, is also much higher than the world average. So it's not a very beautiful picture, but there are also many interesting examples of companies that are doing the right things. So there's a bleak picture, but there's also enthusiastic experiences. And I'm sure that UNOPS and UNESCO, ILO, World Bank have encountered these companies. These are the companies you're working with. But I would say that probably they're a minority of companies. One other interesting fact is that SMEs, the small and medium-sized enterprise, they actually underperform when compared to larger companies in the Arab world, when you're talking about ESG. And you know, SMEs are an extremely important part of the economy in the Arab world. So there needs to be more attention to SMEs. If we're saying that the private sector in general is not doing well, the SMEs are doing even worse. So there needs to be special attention for the SMEs in the Arab world in terms of environmental, social, and governance sustainability. But one interesting and positive fact is that women-led enterprises in the Arab world outperform men-led enterprises. But as I mentioned before, they're also a minority of the companies, but they do in general have a better performance in the three indicators, like environmental, social, and governance. One other finding in the governance side is about civil rights and even privacy rights that are extremely low in the region compared to other regions. And this is also something that should be taken into account. So these are the main findings. And let's move into what's driving private sector interest in the SDGs or sustainability. So the main finding, it's that government is the main driver and procurement is part of that. So government can play even a stronger role, not only through regulations or standards, of water, like when you produce a product, it has to be energy efficient, your fridges or your vacuum cleaners or so on. But sustainable procurement comes here. We can explore the fact that the government is the main pusher for sustainability actions by the private sector. But it's not the only one. Increasingly, the private sector is seeing that they need to adapt in order to ensure their profits. More and more resources are scarce, which means they become more expensive. So it's difficult for private sector companies to act or produce in a world where inputs are more and more expensive and where water might not be available. So they understand that we need to take action in favor of the SDGs. And also a third element that influences private sector interest in the SDGs is customer preference. Historically, the region underperformed other regions in terms of customers mentioning that sustainability was a main factor in their decisions of purchase decisions, but that's starting to change. So some surveys in the region, customers are increasingly demonstrating that they are interested in sustainability and that some of them are willing to pay for sustainability in the product. What we do find, though, is that ultimately most of the private sector actions in the region are still in the field of corporate social responsibility. They haven't moved, the companies haven't moved to a more integrated approach that would have this concept of shared value with society and the environment, which was mentioned by, I think, every single one of the previous speakers. So we are not there yet, but some companies are there. And I think we can highlight these companies as examples moving forward. Moving to a different side of the contribution of the private sector, like this, until now I was focusing on the private sector actions. How can they deliver the SDGs through their actions? Another way the private sector can contribute to SDG delivery is through financing. So we see that very little, actually there's abundant capital, there's abundant private capital. And even in this region, this is the only developing region where capital outflows are greater than inflows. So the region is sending more money out than it's receiving from the rest of the world. It's the only developing region where that happens. So there's plenty of capital, private capital, but it's just not going to the SDGs. So according to an estimate by ESCWA, 12 Arab countries have a SDG financing gap of $660 billion per year to achieve the SDGs. This does not include the LDCs. It's only the the middle income and high income countries. The challenge then is how to get this huge basket of capital and make it go where we want it to go, to the SDGs. How can we move in that direction? So the government plays a fundamental role in that. One important way is to have a new set of supporting policies that can support, for example, sustainable procurement, but also circular economy and other types of policies that can promote the SDGs. Public-private partnerships. The government should invest in developing these relationships, but also creating their own capacity to enter these partnerships and ensure that they're beneficial and that they have the public good in mind. Another strategy is for countries to come up with bankable project pipelines, because usually countries have a development plan and they have investment plans, like what they want to do, how they want to do, but they don't have a pipeline of projects that they can present to the private sector. And ESCWA has been involved in trying to facilitate this with some countries in the area of climate finance, for example. So to conclude, I would say that the private sector is increasingly an important partner for the SDGs, but it's not replacing the government. It will never replace the government. So sustainable procurement is an example of a partnership where both of them are working together. So I'm very excited to be here today. I'm learning a lot about sustainable procurement, and I'm happy to share the publication. If you haven't gotten it yet, you can get it upstairs. We have the printed copies, or you can check them online. That's even more sustainable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mario. It's very insightful, and I do look forward to going through the report on my flight back home. So thank you very much. I would like to thank everyone for your patience. I know we've overrun due to the delays from downstairs. So I'm going to like to open the floor to questions and answers, and we'll push on a couple of questions. Can I please open the floor for some questions, please?
Thank you. My name is Silvana Laiz from the Arab Forum for the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Excuse me if the designing of my question does not directly hit your topics, but I think it's very much related. I believe sustainable procurement should reflect also the values of the designing of the development goals and development projects. So I have two aspects that I would like to discuss. How are we ensuring accessibility in the operational level and in the procurement process? And here I mean accessibility for everyone regarding disabilities, visual impairment, and others. It is very important for ensuring justice. My other second part of the question is, how are we including diversity within the designing of the procurement processes and the project? For me, it's related. I cannot divide between the procurement and what we want to achieve. And currently, and unfortunately, we are still very far from ensuring this in the process. And I would like to give one example from the 3RF in Lebanon, the Reform and Recovering Plan. I was sitting in the CSO's group for consultation, And every time I tried to raise these issues, I wouldn't get practicality. I get answers positive, but always there were answers only to explain why it's not possible to be included. And even the World Bank itself, I remember there was this project B5, and to my surprise, when they presented it, I know that the World Bank usually have the what it's called the social environmental criteria. So they were not present in the when it comes to people with disability, and they were very frank. They said simply that they forgot, and I had to call for a meeting, special meeting, to discuss this and to try to see how to add. So my question to you, is it possible to look at the tools, to look at the whole structure of the procurement, so that whenever people who designed the project forget any point, this other part can be a reminder or a way to help implement? Because even when you say enabling means also that everyone who is involved, no matter at what station, they should be very well aware and equipped to deal and to manage diversity, especially when we talk about disaster management and so on. Thank you. Sorry if I took long.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. I think that please don't apologize, because your question actually highlights the holistic nature and the holistic need of what sustainable procurement is. I would like to ensure that we don't neglect our panelists online. So I'd like to offer this first question to Vanya, because I know that I can reference that under the action plans from the Secretary General's office, we have the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy. And under that, we have what's called Indicator 8. Indicator 8 is how to approach disability inclusion from a supplier or a procurement process perspective. So Vanya, could I please pull you in to comment on this from an ILO perspective, please?
Sure, thank you, Marcus. You provided part of the answer. At the UN level, yes, we have a UN Disability Inclusion Strategy, and we have, through our interagency procurement network, we are developing joint approach, and then at the level of each agency, we are trying to implement it and comply with certain criteria that have been defined and agreed among the procurement, UN procurement community. Sylvia, I think she used the right word, design. These criteria of inclusion have to be embedded in the project from the outset. So the project design is a key element that will then facilitate integration of these criteria of inclusion in our tender documents, in our contracts, in the implementation of what we are doing. From the ILO perspective, ILO pays particular attention to full compliance with criteria of non-discrimination. As far as procurement is concerned, that means in concrete terms that our tender documents, our procurement guidance, our procurement manual is accessible to people with disabilities, so they can participate in our tenders, in our activities. They can also understand how do we operate, what is required in order to comply with the requirements. In terms of diversity, we haven't seen the short video at the beginning of the session, but as part of the design, the way the projects are designed, we are also have included and agreed with the donor to include criteria of job creation for people with disabilities. So one of the performance indicators of this project is to create jobs which are specifically dedicated to people with disabilities. Then if we are talking about the works that we are doing there, mainly construction, road construction, renovation works, the way this is designed is to allow, full accessibility to people with disabilities. So there are many aspects and that in which we can then apply these criteria of sustainability in the procurement process.
Thank you very much, Vanya. I've also just been told by our technical support that the videos are ready to play, but maybe we'll run them at the end of the Q&A session. Is there anyone on the panel that would like to respond, or we can open up more questions?
Yeah, I think since the World Bank was mentioned, I see myself,
I didn't notice.
I have to. So first, thank you, Silvana, for raising this. And I am fully aware of the 3RF and specifically the B5 project. And just also before going to the B5 project, I fully echo Vanja, because there is no constraints in terms of participating in bids for everyone. So specifically for the bank. So it's an open competition. It's we always push for more competition rather than being very constrained about whom to invite and whom to request to bid. So our procurement regulations is the principle is competition, the principle is transparency, and of course, inclusiveness. And I myself, I am a big promoter of diversity and inclusion. I am a focal point for the diversity and inclusion at the bank, and I always push for it. For the B5 project, I know that the team was fully conscious to have everyone included in the project. Excellent. This is why we look for engagement of everyone, and this is why we do our stakeholder consultations, basically, to look for the challenges and barriers, and to look for people who are living on the ground those challenges, and to hear from them, to give us those ideas to implement. So it is very important, and I'm gonna check as well with the B5 project, with the 3RF, which I am part of as well, so to make sure that we cover everyone basically in the project, because after all, this is a project for everyone. The objective is whomever was affected by the Port of Beirut explosion must be included in this project, and we'll look into this very specific comment with the team. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jocelyn. And interestingly, Sylvia, the UNDIS report was submitted on the 15th of March back to the Secretary General's office. I have a question over here from the gentleman on my right, please.
Thank you, Marcus, and thank you all panelists. My name is Saeed Al-Muharrami. I am a member of the State Council in Oman. My question regarding the definition of sustainable procurement, it seems like there is no agreed definition on sustainable procurement, and it depends whom you will be asking. If we had another panelist, for example, the definition will be totally different. So we are having the government institutions, international, for example, institutions, the private sector, the SMEs, the community, the suppliers of services and goods. If you ask them about sustainable procurement, each one of them will be giving you a different definition. The private sector, for example, of course, value for money. This is what they care about for suppliers and goods and services, the highest return of their goods and services. For the international institution, we are talking about the equality and diversity and maybe something like SDG. But for the government, they care much more than this. You know, they look at the whole picture. So they are concerned about the economy, for example, improving balance of trade, for example, minimizing the important items and goods, increasing GDP, creating more jobs, saving, as His Excellency said, saving the environment. So they are also concerned about different issues. And accordingly, my question, who should be responsible about setting the minimum requirement for the sustainable procurement? Is it the government and the institutions or the market with different, goals and of trying to achieve or defining the sustainable procurement? Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. I think it's a very important question which highlights the misunderstanding, some of the complexities about interpretation. I'd like to open the...
You want to take a few more questions?
Okay, I'll take the lady down on my left, please.
Hello, good morning or good afternoon. My name is Kinda Hattar. I'm from Transparency International, MENA Regional Advisor. I want to say thank you to Dr. Nasser. We've been partners in speaking about this for 2 years, but one of the main points that he thankfully mentioned is we're speaking from our part. We're speaking from a UN's perspective. We're speaking from procurement, international standards that were set out there. We're trying to bring it in through UN agencies or the World Bank. But there is another element to that. It's the business integrity. The integrity of the business sector, the private sector, is somehow left to either civil society to work towards making businesses actually realize that they need to have that integrity, or to try and push also all agencies or investors or to actually look at the due diligence. Like, I would have liked to see here in the room somebody from the private sector coming and speaking about procurement, but that would have been a huge responsibility on which private sector are you going to get, because do we do the due diligence of having a clean private sector that can actually speak up to those principles? I would call as Transparency International to work with agencies, the UN, if it's well, to work. We have a business integrity program that we need to work on to make those businesses able to compete in a very good competitive process, as we're requesting government to have clean procurement processes. So it's a two-way and a two parallel track that we need to take. Another thing, we can discuss these in more details, but I'm just pointing out some headlines that we really need to recognize when we speak about sustainable procurement. We need sustainable private sector with social responsibility, with integrity in order to invest, or also allow small businesses and not the big tycoons to take over all these procurements. Of course, with making sure that we have conflict of interest legislations, no revolving doors, interaction on a political level, and all that, and lobbying standards. Another thing that I would have wanted to hear, maybe not here or maybe in your documents and the things regarding the move towards digitalization of the procurement system. We're speaking about standards and sustainability, but digitalization and e-procurement systems where we have less interaction with the bidders, basically, and it is a very important tool. So when we speak about what tools can we do for sustainable development, it is another element that is worth exploring, and having good governance in that system is very important. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have another question from the floor, please.
Thank you. My question is to you, Your Excellency, if you may. So we have been discussing during today and yesterday a lot of interventions regarding collaborative partnerships, and the Deputy of General Secretary mentioned that we need to work on more genuine partnership between different parties. So what would Your Excellency recommend as a law enforcement in order to ensure there's guided and a smooth path for partnerships between different parties within the communities, so we can reach sustainable value and supply chain within our communities and in the private sector. So is there any guided plan that can be set in place, or a drafted legislation, for example, tax incentives, or I don't know, these are suggestions, but I'd love to hear from you, Your Excellency. What would you recommend in order to have a clear guide for ensuring there is partnership and sustainable partnership between different parties? Thank you.
I think we'll go to the panel to respond to the questions and then come back for a couple more. It's okay.
You want me to answer? Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for the remarks and the questions. I think they're all relevant, although I would actually invite my colleagues in the panel to come in, particularly on the procurement, field of procurement, as my colleague and friend from Oman mentioned. I think I want to put it this way. We need to look and think like the private sector, like the more responsible private sector, as Kinda mentioned, the more private sector that's socially and environmentally conscious and responsible on the return on investment. I think the ROI for government sector is less used, and as a matter of fact, and I witnessed this firsthand. We think of development projects and priorities, but let's accept it. The time frame for politicians is very, very short compared to the time frame for development agencies, or even for private sector, or for many, many other stakeholders. We think around, in more established democracies, around the election time. I want to work for the next 3-4 years. In less mature democracies, maybe there's more stability at certain positions, but even at the level of government, things change quickly. So the return on investment is key dimension that we need to include in the discussion and discourse of the work of government. So if we want to invest $1 million in this field or that field, we need to think of the dividends, the return, not only, and that's for the someone in government, not actually as a profit, but the public value that we can get out of this, but also environmental, also social. That's why it's not straightforward, it's not clear cut. You need to include all of these as we think of the investment we do at the level of government. So if I'm going to invest, and that's something we do discuss, at least at the level of Lebanese government, when we discuss a certain project, what's actually the return of this? And then we look into the environmental cost of such project or intervention. It's not easy. There are a lot of trade-offs, and this is the work of, even in democracies, a lot of the trade-offs. But we need to draw the line on what to accept and not to accept when it comes to environmental degradation or environmental issues. So do we actually, and to give example from certain sectors, well-established sectors, let's take cement industry, also in Jordan, in Lebanon, elsewhere. It's quite in Egypt. It's a well-established industry even before the birth of nation states, like in Lebanon and elsewhere. But if you want to protect this industry, which is in multi-billion dollars, from the perspective of the industry alone, the cost on the environment is huge. So here comes the trade-off. What you're gonna do here? Not an easy question, as we say in the policy language. It is a wicked policy question. What to do? What to do in this policy question? Do you give them free hand and to make this industry, prosperous? So you bring in the IFC to support, and they do actually support this industry, and don't look at the environmental cost of it, which is in billions and billions of dollars over time. So it's not an easy question, it's not an easy take, but we need to include the environmental dimensions, and there's a line that we need to draw when it comes to this investment. So I think I didn't clear it. I made it even more ambiguous, but but this is what we need to think of. We need to think if this project is we need to support, and then yet it has a lot of environmental costs. So why do we need it? But so to look at the dividends, let's put it the environmental and social dividends of or return of any investment. We need to include them. It's not only highways as such. That the highway need to serve something. It needs to actually include not only the economic growth, but also the social environmental. Look at the social environmental cost of this. And I fully agree with Kinda on the integrity of the private sector, and we have a long way, honestly, particularly in this part of the world, to engage with a genuine elsewhere, but in this part of it, to engage in a genuine and socially and environmentally responsible private sector. And I mentioned in my opening remarks, aside from some greenwashing exercises that we hear here and there, we need actually to work towards the genuinity of the private sector. And on what I advise, on law enforcement, I think the discussion here at the level of the concepts, but of course, you need strong institutions in order to make best of all this discussion. And strong institutions mean those institutions do cater for the welfare of people and the environment. Judiciary being independent, different government departments being actually active, local authorities. And that's, again, very challenging, particularly at those times of crises that we face, whether in Lebanon or in other developing countries. But strong institutions is definitely key for the implementation of any policy, whether it's procurement, green recovery, inclusion, and so on. If we don't build strong institutions, a lot of this exercise will remain intellectual.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Anne-Claire?
Yeah, I'll just make a very short point on the business integrity, because I think it's actually a critical one. And I actually chair a committee within UNOPS, which is the Vendor Review Committee, where we will look at unethical practices, fraud, etc., within our vendors. If we see any instance of this, it does go through an audit process, and then vendors are disbarred from participating in UN procurement processes. We share this information across all of the other UN agencies so that the information is fully transparent. And these are serious disbarments. They go from 3 years to 10 years, depending on the outcome of the process. And you're not just automatically rehabilitated. So the vendor then has to actually ask to be rehabilitated at the end of their sanction period. And if they do get awarded a contract after that, and this is what we do in UNOPS, they then have to go through a whole site assessment around their sustainability practices to demonstrate that they're actually committed to bettering themselves as an organization. So sadly, this is post-fact. So, it's once you've either they've participated in a tender or actually even been contracted, but it's a small incremental step. But I've worked with TI in the past, and I think the business integrity, program is something that we're trying to build a platform in UNOPS where we're trying to give suppliers access to tools that they can use within their processes. Unfortunately, these are the ones where you'd like to think it's probably the businesses that already have a certain level of integrity that will be interested in using these tools. But, we keep promoting them in the work that we do. So it's something we try to take seriously. But yeah, it's a challenge for all of us, especially, as you said, in a digital era where you don't even have potential physical contact with your supplier until they're actually on site delivering the goods and services.
Thank you, Anne-Claire. Are there any more interventions from the panelists before we take any questions from the floor?
Yeah, let me maybe also add echo first, Anne-Claire, on how important this when we talk about integrity, especially at the bank, because this is at the core of the bank. And we know that we have the fraud and corruption guidelines, for example, but I want to mention that our latest practice that is now in place is to publish what we call beneficiary ownership, which actually mention who owns such firm that were awarded a contract. So this is something that even in the most advanced country that is not yet practiced. And we started this maybe a couple of months ago. So this is part of, this is a challenge that we are facing, and that's a reality, but this is part of how we are addressing this challenge in terms of integrity in doing procurement. Thank you.
Thank you, Jocelyn. Before we move on to more questions, Vanya, would you like to take the floor?
Yes, thank you. I just want to complement what my predecessor said, and to provide part of response to Transparency International. The question is about digital transformation, and that's exactly one of the mitigation measures that we are putting in place by developing and deploying different tools such as UN Global Marketplace that we use to share information about vendor performance, debarment, etc., but also by intensively deploying e-sourcing or e-tendering platforms that allow for more transparency, more accountability. And as far as ILO is concerned, we are about to roll out our e-sourcing platform to all regions, so including Arab region. Our most important contracts are already processed through e-sourcing platform. And when we are talking about sustainable procurement criteria, they're fully integrated. So whenever we are publishing something, these sustainable procurement criteria, they're clearly indicated on the platform. And that's also how we shape the business practices of local private sector and business community.
Thank you very much, Vanya. Also, I'd like to echo the accessibility component of the UN Global Marketplace and the enhanced accessibility as well, Sylvia, of using e-tendering platforms as well as a wider functionality within the UN. Sorry. Can I please take the question from the gentleman at the back?
Marcus, can I add one more on the digitalization of the procurement systems?
Yes, please go ahead.
That was raised also here. So I will give an example here in Lebanon. We recently, we have seen the ratification of the new procurement law. And we have, the World Bank is now supporting the government in establishing and putting in place a new procurement system. So this is an ongoing job that we are doing now with the government. And same thing, we have, like, for example, Jordan has established a new procurement not long time ago. So in the region, we are helping also the countries to put in place and to move, to transform, if you want, to digitalization, including e-procurement systems. Thank you, sorry.
No problem. Thank you very much, Jocelyn. To the very patient gentleman at the back.
شكرا سيدي. اسمي عبد السلام نداه، مدير التخطيط بالمندوبية السامية للتخطيط في المملكة المغربية. ارتباطا بموضوع الأمس، يعني دور القطاع الخاص في تنفيذ أهداف التنمية المستدامة، فعلا أرى أن هناك مسؤولية مشتركة بين القطاع العام والقطاع الخاص في تنفيذ أهداف التنمية المستدامة، وخاصة تفعيل المبدا ديال المشتريات او الشراء المستدام، يعني الاستهلاك والانتاج المستدام. وهنا اقول في اول يعني مرحله من بناء تفكير حول استراتيجي حول يعني تشجيع شراء المشتريات المستدامه، لابد من توفير المعطيات الاحصائيه، البيانات الاحصائيه حول مدى انخراط القطاع الخاص في يعني الشراء المستدام. وهنا فقط اذكر بان في المندوبيه الساميه للتخطيط فعلا في اطار البحوث والموسوعات الاحصائيه التي نقوم بها لدى المقاولات، فعلا نخصص محور خاص بمدى تجاوب او انخراط المقاولات الخاصه القطاع الخاص في احترام البيئة، عن طريق بعض الأسئلة التي يعني حول التي تمكننا من جمع المعلومات حول انخراطهم في الحد من انبعاث الملوثات، في حماية الموارد المائية، ثم في معالجة النفايات، وفي استخدام الطاقات المتجددة. إذا باش يكون عندنا معطيات حول قدرة وانخراط القطاع الخاص في احترام هذه المعايير أو الأبعاد في التنمية المستدامة. ولكن يتضح أن القطاع الخاص الآن باعتبار اقتصاديات في المنطقة العربية هي في الحقيقة تجد في وضعية صعبة من حيث التنافسية الاقتصادية أصلا، لأن إذا لاحظنا في مستوى إنجاز أهداف التنمية المستدامة أو على مستوى التنافسية الاقتصاديات، فهي أصلا في وضعية صعبة مقارنة بالأسواق الاقتصادية العالمية. فإذا السؤال المطروح هو الانتقال الآن من استعمال الموارد التقليدية من أجل تسريع أهداف التنمية المستدامة، الآن نطالب القطاع الخاص او حتى كذلك الحكومات يعني الى الانتقال الى ربما السلوكات المستدامه في الاستهلاك وفي الانتاج من اجل يعني تحقيق هذه الاهداف التنميه المستدامه. وبالتالي السؤال المطروح كيف ان اخذا بعين الاعتبار وضعيه الاقتصاد او ضعف التنافسيه الاقتصاد في المنطقه العربيه، فشنو ما هي الحلول او يعني الاجراءات العمليه للانتقال السلس من الوضعيه الحاليه اللي فيها وضعيه ربما كما قلت تنافسيه متوسطه الى استعمال المشتريات الاستدامه وجعلها وتحويلها من تحدي الى رافعه لتقليص الفجوه على المستوى التنافس الاقتصادي ما بين دول المنطقه العربيه وربما الدول المتقدمه. شكرا.
Thank you very much for the very detailed question. Your Excellency, would you like to take the floor?
أود أن أقول إنه I want to say in English or Arabic. In Arabic. Yeah, it's good to speak a bit in Arabic. لازم. كل لغة التنمية بالإنجليزي يعني وبهالطريقة بنكون عم نترك كثير من الناس ما يتعاطوا مع هذه المفاهيم. لا أنا أود أن أقول أنا موافق بشكل كامل مع ما تقدم به زميلنا من المملكة المغربية على أهمية يعني توعية القطاع الخاص بشكل مستمر على مبادئ الشراء العام والشراء المستدام وغيرها من المفاهيم وإدخالها بشكل أساسي وليست فقط يعني تكون هيك شكلية أو كوزماتكس كما نقول أو تجميلي.
Jocelyn, would you like to intervene?
I mean, I completely agree with His Excellency. ما بعرف إذا رح أقدر أرد بالعربي مثل ما هو جاوب باللغة بس في إلا كمان إنه نحن بالمغرب كتير عم نكون engaging مع البرايفت سيكتور وفي عنا كتير programs عطول awareness و communication campaigns و outreach عم بتصير بخصوص sustainable procurement وخاصة للSMEs مش بس البرايفت سيكتور in general خاصة للSMEs لحتى to build their capacity نعطيهم التريننج اللازم حتى يقدروا يكونوا competitive in terms of sustainable procurement ويقدروا يوصلوا للمرحلة اللي غير بلدان فيها ممكن تكون متقدمة أكثر من المنطقة هون إذا بدنا نقول بالشرق الأوسط وحتى بمنطقة الشرق الأوسط في بلدان مقدمة أكثر من غيرها. في عنا مثلا project هلا بموروكو مع focus on green procurement. actually هو البروجكت بموروكو تونيجيا وبجوردن والفوكس عم بيصير على green procurement. One of the steps أو in the action plan هو مش بس to do an assessment of whatever is existing but also to help the private sector, the suppliers, the firms, everyone who is involved in the procurement process to be aware of what is a green procurement and how to leverage the resources for a green procurement. So this is part of the programs that the World Bank is working on, which is building the capacity of suppliers, building the capacity of private sector, and doing the outreach and communication necessary to help them understand more this concept of sustainable procurement and particularly green procurement. I continued in English, but
Thank you very much, Jocelyn. I'm just wondering, are there any interventions online? Vanya, Masonda?
Yes, if I may just quickly, in terms of, the response to the gentleman's question, there are two fundamental aspects important to successful implementation of sustainable public procurement. One is capacity building, and in terms of ILO, it's of course directed towards ILO staff, but also the companies that participate in our tenders. And then the second part, fundamental part, is monitoring, evaluation, and reporting. And in terms of ILO experience, what we have agreed with our donors and what we have embedded in our project is the dedicated function to monitoring and reporting. We have what we call social safeguards officers that are part of each and every project and then regularly monitor compliance with different criteria, including criteria of sustainability. So one of the measures or preconditions sine qua non the success of implementation of sustainable procurement policy is reliable reporting and data that come back from the project.
Thank you very much, Vanya. I'm just wondering if there are any closing comments, any closing questions. I think we've really appreciated everybody's patience as we've gone beyond our allocated time. And
I think to end with thanking UNOPS for organizing this panel. Very interesting And I thought it will be very dry and technical, especially in the UN House. But it ended to be quite interesting, and we raised some very interesting issues. So thank you, UNOPS team, for this, and ESCWA for hosting us and for hosting this important forum. Thank you.
And that ends our special session on sustainable procurement. Thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you.
Thank you.